In our last session, we discussed how global oneness is no longer a utopian ideal, but a necessity for survival. In our day, it has become an urgent necessity. Oneness is not a new idea. Psychologically, it is our natural original state, to which humanity yearns to return. The great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, in his Perpetual Peace, envisioned a world of cosmopolitanism and international cooperation where humanity could live together in harmony. It is not difficult to imagine the peace, mutual cooperation, and shared prosperity that would be possible if there were truly global unity. Now, the rise of the nation-state in the aftermath of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 fundamentally undermined global unity in the modern era. Certainly, there were divisions in the past, but the creation of nation-states delineated by territorial borders, distinct cultural identities, and centralized political powers shifted us from an interconnected global community into fragmented and competitive sovereign entities. In tandem with nationalism, the rise of nation-states facilitated imperialism, which imposed the domination of certain peoples over others, and this intensified discrimination among groups within their borders, ironically, segregating people based on race, ethnicity, and gender, ultimately exacerbating the inequalities that we see today. So first, how did the nation-state arise? The 17th century Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, one of the most violent regions of the world at the time, was signed in the cities of Osnabrück and Münster. It established the principle of national sovereignty and set the stage for the development of nation-states. Before this, empires, kingdoms, and city-states were the dominant political entities. The Roman Empire of antiquity, for example, although extensive, encompassed a variety of cultures, religions, and ethnicities. Similarly, the 13th century Mongol Empire brought together vast territories through conquest and military power, but it did not rely on a shared national identity as a unifying force. It was only in the 16th century that monarchs, oligarchs, and eventually capitalist elites began consolidating power through centralized territories, creating the basis for the modern nation-state. A major turning point was the French Revolution of 1789, which transformed Europe's political landscape. The revolution was grounded in the principle of governance by citizens, for whom national identity was more important than rank. This elevated the importance of a shared culture, language, and history as the defining features of a people. French military Napoleon Bonaparte spread this ideology through his 19th century wars across Europe. Nationalism, in this context, became a movement that sought to create homogeneous nation-states, where political borders coincided with cultural and ethnic divisions. As nationalism gained prominence, however, it also created divisions that counteracted earlier cosmopolitan ideals. The idea of the nation-state centered on exclusive membership, which inherently marginalized non-citizens and minority groups. As such, nationalism's rise meant a retreat from global unity toward an emphasis on boundaries, distinctions, and the interests of the nation-state. This brings us to our second question. How did nation-states lead to imperialism? With the consolidation of national power, nation-states began to expand their reach. This expansion took the form of imperialism, as European nations with distinct national identities sought to extend their control over new territories. The territorial acquisition by nation-states was seen as both a reflection of their power as well as a means of securing resources in competition with other nation-states. This is how in the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially Britain, France, and Belgium embarked on large-scale colonization in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, where they imposed artificial boundaries and hierarchical systems of control. Very much the way Portugal and the Netherlands did centuries earlier. Therefore, with nation-states focusing on their expansion of power and identity through imperialism, imperialism became inextricably linked to racism. European powers justified imperialism through a belief in the superiority of their culture and civilization, which relied on a racialized notion of human hierarchy. These theories posited that non-European peoples were, quote-unquote, inferior and in need of European governance, such that a, quote-unquote, civilizing mission included bringing European values and systems of governance to what were deemed, quote-unquote, backward societies. More inland countries, such as Germany, tried to, quote-unquote, colonize minority groups within their borders, which the brilliant Swedish author Sven Lindqvist hypothesized as the driving force behind the Holocaust in his compelling book, Exterminate All the Brutes. Imperialism, in other words, was a product of competition between emerging nation states as the need to assert sovereignty and to expand power through colonial conquest expanded. For example, the British Empire saw itself as a civilizing force in its colonies while simultaneously enforcing strict racial and cultural hierarchies. Imperialism thus imposed not only political or economic structure, but a cultural one, whereby European powers sought to force their language, religion, and social stratification on colonized peoples, while simultaneously asserting their quote-unquote superior mission as benevolent. This gives rise to our third question. How did imperialism lead to racism, sexism, and other forms of inequality? As colonized people were encouraged to adopt Western ways of life, including European languages, customs, and values, this might have given rise to the hope for cohesion between the colonies and the imperial state. However, because the nation-state model is based on coercive imposition, it would eventually lead to oppression and violence. When emphasis is on national unity, promoting the exclusion of those who are deemed to be other, it can give rise to marginalized or even persecuted groups. For example, in the United States, the rise of nationalism reinforced the separation of Native American populations and the institution of slavery, which was racially motivated and framed as necessary for the nation's economic development. Hence, Americans would come to abolish slavery even later than their so-called oppressors, the British. The rhetoric of the nation-state, as defined by white nationalism, rendered minority groups as inferior and subordinate in their political, social, and economic rights. Gender relations, too, were profoundly shaped by the rise of nationalism. In many nationalist movements, women were confined to the private sphere, where their primary role was seen as ensuring the reproduction of the national population. Women's participation in public life was often restricted, and their identities were frequently tied to the perceived purity of the nation's culture. In colonial contexts, women were even framed as needing to be, quote-unquote, rescued from their supposed oppression, while simultaneously reinforcing patriarchal gender norms. In this manner, the notion of nation-state did not end at the national level, but extended their divisionist Weltanschauung both inward and outward.